Decades before Columbus ever set sail, European spies were charting coastlines they weren't supposed to know existed, maps hidden in royal vaults, whispers of forbidden voyages. This is the untold story of how the old world saw the new long before they claimed it. It begins with a map. Not a map made after explorers returned from the Americas, but one created before any European ship officially touched its shores. The year is 1513. An admiral in the Ottoman Empire, Piri Reis, compiled a chart of the known world. He claims to have used older sources, some Greek, some Arabic, but crucially, some from European sailors. The result is a fragmentary map drawn on gazelle skin that shows something no one expected: the coastline of South America, accurately rendered, decades before much of it was explored. This map shouldn't exist, but it's not alone. There's the Vinland map, which surfaced in the 20th century, allegedly drawn in the 15th century, showing parts of the North American continent with uncanny placement. Then there are the Zeno maps, the Cantino Planisphere, and the Waldseemüller world map of 1507, each of them revealing lands that, officially, had not yet been discovered. These are not mere curiosities. They are historical landmines, quietly challenging the official narrative of discovery. Because if these maps are authentic, and if they were based on sources that predate Columbus, then we must ask, who knew what and when? Before the sails of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria ever caught the wind, were there whispers of land across the Atlantic? Did spies, traders, or rogue navigators pass this forbidden knowledge into royal courts long before their monarchs claimed it as newly found? And most importantly, were maps used not as tools of exploration, but as weapons of empire? For centuries, maps were treated as sacred artifacts. They were symbols of power, tools of conquest, and repositories of closely guarded secrets. In a time when land equaled power, and power was drawn in ink across parchment, a map could win a war before the first ship set sail. So how did these maps come to be? And what does their quiet existence tell us about the secret history of European exploration? To find the answers, we have to go back. Before Columbus, before the Treaty of Tordesillas, even before the word America was ever inked onto a page. What we find there is not a story of heroic adventure, but one of espionage, politics, and silent cartographers whose work may have changed the course of history without ever setting foot on the lands they drew. Take the Cantino Planisphere, for example. Created in 1502, it's one of the earliest surviving maps showing parts of Brazil just 2 years after Cabral's official landing. But here's the twist. It was stolen. Alberto Cantino, an Italian agent, smuggled it out of Portugal to sell it to the Duke of Ferrara. The Portuguese, alarmed by the leak of sensitive geographic data, attempted to secure their cartographic secrets even more tightly afterward. This was not an isolated event. In the decades to come, the theft, sale, and forgery of maps would become a high-stakes game of cat and mouse between rival empires. But the deeper question remains: how did the Portuguese know so much, so soon? Some historians believe the Portuguese crown was already in possession of ancient seafaring knowledge compiled from Arab traders, African navigators, and perhaps even Norse explorers. Others suggest that they mounted covert reconnaissance missions long before announcing their discoveries to the world, quietly mapping coastlines in secret and only revealing their findings when politically convenient. It's worth noting that for nearly 70 years before Columbus's voyage, Portugal had been building a vast intelligence network across the Atlantic and along the West African coast. Their maps were considered state secrets. Revealing them was treason. If those maps included knowledge of lands across the ocean, gathered through stolen logs, intercepted sailors, or forgotten ancient texts, they would never have been shared openly. Instead, they were copied in whispers, locked in court libraries, and occasionally smuggled out by spies and opportunists. This clandestine history blurs the line between myth and fact, between discovery and design. For too long, we've accepted a simple story that the old world was ignorant of the new until 1492. But the paper trail tells a different tale. A map drawn in Constantinople, a manuscript locked in a monastery, a parchment carried by a diplomat. Each piece of evidence adds weight to the possibility that Europe's so-called discovery of the Americas was not a bold leap into the unknown, but the execution of a long-held secret plan. And yet, for every surviving map, countless others have been lost to fire, war, and time. What secrets did they carry? What coastlines were etched into them by hands that history forgot? In the end, these shadows on parchment aren't just strange anomalies. They are the fingerprints of a hidden world, a network of spies, scholars, and seafarers who saw further than they were allowed to admit. This is their story, and it's only just beginning. Long before Columbus sailed west under the Spanish flag, the Atlantic was not empty. It was vast, yes, dangerous, unpredictable, and untamed, but not unknown. Sailors had been feeling its winds and tides for centuries. And though their names rarely appear in history books, their voyages carved out invisible paths across the ocean long before the so-called Age of Discovery ever began. In 1960, on the rocky northern tip of Newfoundland, a team of Norwegian archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary: the ruins of a Norse settlement preserved beneath centuries of turf. Lance aux Meadows, as it's now called, offered irrefutable proof that Viking explorers reached North America around the year 1000, nearly 500 years before Columbus. But the Norse didn't just visit. According to the Icelandic sagas, oral histories later transcribed, Leif Erikson and his crew called the land Vinland, and they returned more than once. They described timber-rich coasts, wild grapes, and hostile encounters with native peoples. Whether Vinland was Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, or even further south remains a debated topic. How the point is clear: contact was made, and the knowledge of this land may not have vanished completely. Fragments of that knowledge could have seeped into Europe through trade, conquest, and the slow drift of ideas. In the medieval world, information crept, tucked into monks' manuscripts, whispered in sailors' taverns, or folded into the diplomatic reports sent to courts and kings. Then, there's the mystery of the Basques, master fishermen and navigators who roamed the Atlantic long before Columbus. By the early 1400s, Basque whalers were catching cod in waters so rich and distant that their exact location became a guarded secret. Historians now believe these fishing grounds were off the coast of Newfoundland, and that Basque crews may have landed there, repaired ships, and even established seasonal camps. But if they found new land, why didn't they announce it to the world? Simple. They had no reason to. Secrecy protected profits. If rivals learned of the bounty, the advantage would vanish. For the Basques, the Americas were not a continent to conquer. They were a commercial secret to protect. The Irish, too, have their legend. The story of Saint Brendan, a 6th century monk who, according to medieval texts, sailed west in a leather boat and discovered a lush land across the sea. Although most scholars categorize it as a religious allegory, some historians note similarities between Brendan's descriptions and the actual features of North America. Prope or not, the tale was copied into dozens of manuscripts across Europe, planting the idea that land lay to the west. Perhaps the most controversial theories originate from the west coast of Africa. Some researchers argue that West African sailors may have reached the Americas before Europeans. The Malian Empire, under Mansa Musa's predecessor, reportedly launched a massive ocean expedition in the early 1300s, one that never returned. The story, recorded by Arab historians, tells of a fleet that sailed into the Atlantic in sere new lands. Could they have reached the shores of Brazil or the Caribbean? There's no definitive proof, only carvings, oral traditions, and fragments that defy easy explanation. Still, these stories were not entirely unknown to Europe. Moorish scholars, Arab cartographers, and African sailors frequently interacted with European courts. Their knowledge of winds, stars, and coastlines flowed into the intellectual bloodstream of Renaissance Europe, influencing the very maps we now question. In fact, by the mid-15th century, Portuguese explorers had already begun to ink down the African coast, establishing outposts and gathering intelligence. Their goals were clear: gold, spices, and Islam. But along the way, they also gathered whispers, tales of islands to the west, of lands across the sea where the sun set. Some of these whispers were incorporated into early maps. Look closely at medieval Portolan charts, and you'll find ghost islands, Antilia, Satanazes, Brazil. These weren't figments of imagination. They were placeholders for something real, passed down imperfectly through generations of sailors. What emerges is a picture of the Atlantic not as an empty void, but as a frontier known in fragments, a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The official story of Columbus makes it seem as if Europe awoke one day and decided to sail west. In truth, the idea had been building for centuries. What was missing wasn't the will. It was the political backing, the funding, and the timing. He relied on maps, rumors, and calculations, many of them flawed. But he was sailing into a world that others had already glimpsed, even if dimly. The so-called discovery was not a first step. It was a culmination of forgotten voyages, stolen knowledge, and scattered memories of lands that, to some, had never truly been lost. And in the shadows behind these unofficial contacts, a new power was forming. A network of mapmakers, spies, and state-sponsored explorers who would soon turn ancient whispers into geopolitical weapons. Their work was beginning. In 1558, more than half a century after Columbus crossed the Atlantic, a map was published in Venice, and it set off a firestorm of debate that still hasn't cooled. It showed lands no other map dared to include: Friesland, Estotiland, Drogeo. Strange names, mysterious coastlines, a vast stretch of ocean peppered with islands and continents that weren't supposed to exist, or if they did, weren't meant to be drawn yet. The map was accompanied by a letter, allegedly written by Niccolo Zeno the Younger. In it, he claimed to have discovered a cache of letters and journals from his ancestors, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, two Venetian brothers who, he said, had sailed the North Atlantic in the 1390s, a full century before Columbus. According to the younger Zeno, his ancestors had served under a prince named Zikmeni, a mysterious figure who ruled over unknown northern islands. Together, they journeyed westward, encountering lands with cultures and technologies that were both strange and advanced. The documents described islands beyond Iceland and Greenland, and one, Estotiland, sounded suspiciously like a distorted version of the North American coast. If true, the Zeno brothers may have reached parts of the New World long before the Spanish or Portuguese. They may even have mapped it and brought the knowledge back to Europe, where it sat hidden, misinterpreted, or suppressed. But there's a problem. Historians can't agree if the Zeno story is real or a sophisticated hoax. Some dismiss the entire thing as a 16th century forgery. a political stunt by Zeno the Younger to rewrite Venetian history and boost the city's reputation during an era of imperial decline. After all, by the mid-1500s, Venice was watching from the sidelines as Spain and Portugal divided the world between them. A story that placed Venetian explorers in the New World a century earlier would have been a powerful point of pride, and possibly a claim to influence. Critics point out inconsistencies in the map, invented islands, distorted geography, and locations that don't match known coastlines. Freiland, for example, appears on dozens of later maps, yet it doesn't exist. It was eventually debunked as a phantom island, created from confusion, cartographic error, or perhaps deliberate deception. But others argue the Zeno narrative can't be dismissed so easily. Some of the islands depicted, such as Greenland and parts of Labrador, show uncanny geographic awareness for the 14th century. Details in the letters reference long daylight hours and ice-clogged waters, consistent with Arctic sailing, and the description of a land far to the west with tall trees and long rivers echoes later accounts of North America. Then there's Zichemni himself. Some scholars believe he may be a corrupted version of Henry Sinclair, the Scottish nobleman and rumored transatlantic voyager. According to these fringe theories, Sinclair led an expedition west in the late 1300s, guided by Norse sailors and perhaps even reaching Nova Scotia. The evidence is murky. The timelines are tangled. And yet, the map exists. Even if the Zeno brothers didn't make the journey themselves, someone did. Someone with enough information to piece together a vision of the Atlantic that went far beyond Europe's official knowledge of the time. It raises uncomfortable questions. How did the Venetian mapmakers know about these lands? Were they using stolen information from Norse sagas or lost Portolan charts? Or were they copying from state secrets, smuggled out of Portuguese or Spanish vaults by agents operating in the shadows? In the 15th and 16th centuries, Venice was not just a merchant republic. It was a center of intelligence, espionage, and coded knowledge. Venetian traders traveled the known world, collecting information and selling it to the highest bidder. Their maps were highly prized, not just for their beauty, but for the secrets they contained. Perhaps the Zeno map was part of that trade, a visual cipher that blended truth and fiction, meant to conceal knowledge in plain sight. Or perhaps it was an act of disinformation, a deliberate move to confuse rivals and muddy the waters of exploration. After all, if everyone's chasing phantom islands, no one finds the real ones. Whatever the truth, the Zeno affair highlights a deeper reality. The age of exploration was never just about ships and sails. It was also about knowledge. Who controlled it, who faked it, and who was willing to kill for it. In this world, maps were a form of currency, and sometimes the most powerful maps were the ones that told half-truths, enough to hint at a secret, but never quite reveal it. The Zeno brothers, whether real or invented, left behind more than a strange map. They left a warning. In the shadowy history of exploration, nothing is ever quite what it seems. Because behind every coastline drawn too early, behind every island that shouldn't exist, there's a hand, hidden, careful, and very much aware of what it's doing. In the grand halls of Sagres, at the edge of Europe, a quiet revolution was taking place. The man behind it was not a king. He didn't sail. He never commanded a fleet. And yet, Prince Henry of Portugal, later called the Navigator, would become one of the most potent forces behind Europe's expansion into the unknown. But Prince Henry wasn't just funding voyages. He was orchestrating something far more ambitious, the construction of a secret knowledge empire. And at its heart was a treasure more valuable than gold: maps. Beginning in the early 1400s, Henry established what some have called the world's first intelligence agency for maritime exploration. From his base on the southwestern tip of Portugal, he assembled navigators, cartographers, astronomers, and spies, building a network designed not to conquer, at least not yet, but to gain understanding. The Portuguese crown invested significant resources in charting the African coast. Officially, these voyages were exploratory. Unofficially, they were covert reconnaissance missions. Sailors were ordered not just to travel, but to record meticulously currents, winds, coastlines, and even rumors from local traders. These findings were not shared freely. They were locked away in what became known as the Padrão Real, the Royal Pattern, Portugal's top-secret master map. No copies, no public access. Only select officials, under oath and constant scrutiny, could consult it. In an era where controlling geography meant controlling trade, the Padrão Real became one of the most closely guarded secrets in Europe. And it wasn't just about where to go. It was about who else knew. Henry's network stretched across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and even into the Islamic world. Portuguese agents moved through Genoa, Venice, Cairo, and Constantinople, collecting Arabic charts and ancient manuscripts. They sought out Jewish navigators, Moorish pilots, and anyone who had touched a shoreline Europe hadn't seen. Their mission was simple: find the edges of the known world and see them first. It worked. By the mid-15th century, Portuguese ships had rounded Cape Bojador, a feat that had long been feared as impossible. By the 1480s, they had reached the Congo, and in 1498, 6 years after Columbus, Vasco da Gama made it to India. But what makes Prince Henry's role so crucial to this story is not just his sponsorship of exploration, it's the secrecy with which he operated. Historians have long debated how much the Portuguese really knew before Columbus sailed west. It's no accident that within a few years of 1492, the Portuguese were claiming land in Brazil, a continent no one was supposed to know existed. Some even suggest they had already mapped parts of South America, possibly from the eastern side, using Atlantic currents and intelligence gathered from African navigators. If that knowledge existed, if it were quietly passed up the chain to Prince Henry's successors, it would never have been shared publicly. Geographic knowledge was power, and power was hoarded. Consider the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494. It split the world between Spain and Portugal along an invisible meridian, before much of that world had even been discovered. And yet, somehow, Portugal walked away with Brazil, a land they would accidentally stumble upon just 6 years later. Coincidence? Or cartographic foresight? There are hints, but no smoking gun. That's how the Portuguese liked it. When their cartographers drew maps, they left out certain islands. When they published charts, they moved coastlines. When their spies intercepted foreign maps, they disappeared. This was information warfare, centuries before the term existed. Prince Henry may not have lived to see the Americas mapped, but he laid the groundwork for a system that valued intelligence above exploration. His files, his carefully protected trove of observations, maps, and reports, became the playbook for a generation of explorers. And while other nations looked to the stars or prayed for divine guidance, Portugal looked to its vaults, where absolute power was measured in ink and parchment. The legend of Prince Henry the Navigator often casts him as a dreamer, gazing out to sea. But the honest Prince Henry was something else entirely: a tactician, a collector, and perhaps the first European leader to understand that knowledge of the unknown could shape the fate of empires. His legacy wasn't just in the ships he launched, but in the maps he never let the world see. And somewhere in those silent files, now lost, scattered, or buried in time, may have been early glimpses of a land called America, long before anyone dared to claim it. The oceans were vast, the stakes were unimaginable, and the maps were worth killing for. By the late 15th century, exploration had become more than just a noble pursuit or an act of curiosity. It had become a ruthless race, a zero-sum game where knowledge of coastlines, currents, and hidden lands could tip the balance of global power. And in that race, espionage became just as vital as navigation. Portugal and Spain, the two incredible naval superpowers of the time, weren't just sending ships across the horizon. They were sending spies into each other's courts, ports, and map rooms. And what they were after was no secret: information. In 1502, a man named Alberto Cantino, an Italian agent working for the Duke of Ferrara, pulled off one of the most daring acts of cartographic espionage in history. He bribed Portuguese insiders to acquire a copy of the ultra-secret Padrão Real, the Crown's master map, a living, evolving document that contained the most precise knowledge of the world Portugal had charted. The result was the Cantino Planisphere, a stunning map that revealed details of Brazil, the African coast, and parts of the Indian Ocean, all years ahead of public knowledge. When the map arrived in Italy, it sent shockwaves through Europe's elite. For the first time, rival powers had a glimpse of Portugal's secret hand. The Portuguese were furious, not because they lost a piece of parchment, but because they had lost leverage, the ability to negotiate, to posture, to dominate unclaimed lands through superior intelligence. In response, Lisbon tightened its grip even further. Mapmakers were placed under surveillance. Foreigners were banned from port cities. Sailors were sworn to secrecy under threat of death. The Crown didn't just protect its maps, it weaponized them. But espionage wasn't one-sided. Spain, too, had its network of informants and thieves. After Columbus's first voyage, maps and journals were carefully edited, some say censored, before being copied or shared. The Spanish crown feared that even a glimpse of a new coastline could reveal Portugal or France. To guard against leaks, Spain created a system of piloto mayores, royal navigators who centralized and controlled all maritime data. And yet, somehow, copies still managed through. In the early 16th century, the Spanish discovered that maps of their newly claimed territories were appearing in German and Flemish workshops, far from Iberian control. How? The likely culprits: foreign printers, merchants, and diplomats who bribed, spied, or seduced their way into access. This was not just information theft, it was industrial intelligence gathering. At the heart of this battle were the mapmakers themselves, brilliant, overworked, and often caught between loyalty and profit. Some, like Martin Waldseemüller in the Holy Roman Empire, had access to sources that remain a mystery. His 1507 world map was the first to name America, and it showed parts of South America that hadn't yet been fully explored, at least not publicly. How did he know? Some historians believe he had access to smuggled Spanish or Portuguese charts. Others think he collaborated with scholars who had contacts in the courts of Iberia. But one thing is clear: Waldseemüller's map was not speculation. It was based on something real. Other mapmakers, such the German Sebastian Münster and the Dutch Gerardus Mercator, walked a delicate line, gathering intelligence, synthesizing it, and sometimes distorting it for political or commercial gain. And where maps couldn't be stolen, men could. Captains were bribed, navigators defected, sailors were interrogated in foreign ports. In one infamous case, a Portuguese pilot named Bartolomeu Lopes was reportedly captured by Spanish agents and tortured for information about the Brazilian coast. Even the Jesuits, traveling the globe under the banner of faith, became accidental or intentional intelligence agents. Their letters, often filled with geographic detail, were copied and forwarded across Europe, becoming valuable sources for state cartographers and royal advisors. This hidden war reached into royal courts, printing presses, and the quiet corners of monastic libraries. The battle lines weren't drawn on land or sea, but on parchment, delicate, detailed, and deadly in their consequences. And yet, for all their efforts to protect knowledge, the empires of Spain and Portugal could not contain it. The harder they clutched their secrets, the more valuable those secrets became, and the more others were willing to risk everything to steal them. The irony? Many of these maps, stolen, copied, or forged, proved to be more accurate than the originals. In the competition between secrecy and ambition, it was often the thieves who advanced geography the fastest. By the mid-1500s, maps had become more than tools for navigation. They were instruments of statecraft, used to stake claims, assert dominance, and rewrite reality. And behind every mysterious coastline, every curve of a river not yet seen, was a question. Who saw it first? And who told the world? In the end, the age of discovery was never just about the lands found. It was about the knowledge kept and the men willing to steal it. In a quiet corner of Saint-Dié, a small town nestled in the Vosges mountains of eastern France, a group of scholars was about to change the world, with ink, parchment, and a name. The year was 1507. At the Gymnasium Vosagenso, a humanist academic circle was working on a new project, a world map based on the latest geographic discoveries. At the center of it was a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, a meticulous, brilliant mind who saw in maps not just geography, but the architecture of power. The result of their efforts was the Universalis Cosmographia, a map over 4 feet wide, printed from 12 woodcut panels. It was the first map to show the New World as a separate continent, not an extension of Asia, as Columbus believed, but something entirely different. And then came the real surprise. Waldseemüller named it America. On the southern part of the new continent, in clear block letters, was the name America, a tribute, he wrote, to the Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who had claimed to reach a new world during his voyages between 1497 and 1504. But here's the puzzle that has haunted historians ever since. How did Waldseemüller know? How did he depict the coast of South America with such detail, accuracy, and confidence, years before those coastlines had been thoroughly explored or mapped by Spain or Portugal? Officially, Spanish explorers such as Alonso de Ojeda, Vicente Yáñez Pinzón, and Vespucci himself had sailed along parts of the northern and eastern coasts of South America. But their reports were fragmented, and much of their data was classified. Yet Waldseemüller's map shows a continuous coast, with features that would only later be confirmed by more detailed exploration. The conclusion? He had access to something else. Some scholars believe he used smuggled Portuguese and Spanish charts, perhaps leaked through merchant networks, court informants, or even the printers of Nuremberg and Basel. Others suggest that Vespucci himself may have provided secret information, either in letters or through intermediaries, that was never included in public documents. Another theory suggests that the Strasbourg cosmographer Matthias Ringmann, a close associate of Waldseemüller, may have had access to letters or reports that are now lost. Whatever the source, the map was not speculative. It was based on data someone, somewhere, wasn't supposed to have. However, the implications extend beyond a name. The map drew a clear line. The New World was honest, separate, and open to interpretation. That single act of naming permitted Europe to think of this land not as a part of Asia to be circumnavigated, but as a continent to be divided, colonized, and conquered. It reframed exploration. It reframed the empire. Ironically, Waldseemüller later had second thoughts. In later works, he dropped the name America and aligned more closely with the idea that these new lands were part of Asia. But by then, it was too late. The name had stuck. The idea had spread. Of the original 1,000 copies of the Universalis Cosmographia, only one survives today, discovered in 1901 and now housed in the archives of a German castle. It now sits in the Library of Congress, declared the birth certificate of America. And yet, in the fine lines of that map, behind the graceful sweep of South America's eastern coast, lies an unanswered question. What did Waldseemüller know, and who told him? His work reflects not just bold cartography, but a whisper network of hidden knowledge, traveling quietly across borders, copied by candlelight, passed through hands both trusted and treacherous. This was not the map of an explorer. It was the map of an observer, someone who stood at the crossroads of science, politics, and espionage, piecing together a world others were trying to keep hidden. And just as revealing as the names and coastlines on Waldseemüller's map are the maps that never made it to public view. Because for every world chart sent to a printing press, a dozen more were locked away in monasteries, in royal cabinets, and in the minds of men whose duty was to know, but not tell. For all the maps we see, there are others we were never meant to, hidden in the shadows of empires, behind the stone walls of monasteries, and deep within the archives of royal courts. These were the silent vaults of cartographic power, where knowledge was kept not to inform, but to control. In Chapter 7, we journey into the guarded places of Europe's past to uncover the libraries, archives, and secret collections where the actual shape of the world may have been known, long before the public was allowed to see it. Not all maps were meant to be seen. Some never left the walls where they were drawn. Others were shelved under layers of dust, bound in leather tomes, or hidden in plain sight among religious manuscripts. These were not public records. They were strategic assets, controlled by men of power and preserved by those who knew that information, in the right hands, could change the course of empires. Welcome to the quietest front in the cartographic war, the monasteries and royal courts of Europe. While explorers braved tempests and spies crossed borders, much of the world's most sensitive geographic knowledge was held not in bustling ports or naval academies, but behind the thick walls of monastic libraries and royal archives. These places served as repositories for information that was too dangerous, too valuable, or too politically volatile to circulate freely. The monasteries, especially in Iberia, France, and Italy, played a unique role. Monks were among the few in Europe who could read, write, and copy texts with precision. In their scriptoriums, by candlelight, they painstakingly duplicated ancient works. Roman navigational charts, Arabic star maps, and strange atlases brought back by crusaders, traders, or wandering scholars. Some of these maps hinted at lands across the sea, distorted, half-remembered, but tantalizing. They were bound into codices, labeled with cryptic Latin, and passed down quietly, monk to monk, generation to generation. Occasionally, a detail would leak out. A coastline copied into the margin of a Bible, a map folded inside a Jesuit report. But most of these artifacts remained deep within cloisters, known only to a select few. These religious institutions were not disconnected from politics. On the contrary, they were deeply entwined with the monarchies of Europe, and their knowledge often flowed upward into the hands of kings and queens. Inside the courts of Spain and Portugal, information was currency. Cartographic data collected by sailors, merchants, missionaries, and spies was funneled into royal councils. From there, it was either disseminated strategically or buried. Some monarchs ordered maps destroyed to preserve secrecy. Others created official versions that distorted reality, adding phantom islands or shifting coastlines to confuse their rivals. But behind the propaganda, hidden in court libraries and guarded by trusted advisors, were the real maps, the ones too sensitive to risk falling into enemy hands. The Casa de la Contratación, founded in 1503 in Seville, was one of the most influential institutions of its kind. It served as the administrative heart of Spain's overseas empire, controlling not just trade routes and colonial appointments, but geographic knowledge itself. There, royal cartographers maintained the Padrón Real, the Spanish counterpart to Portugal's secret master map. Access was tightly restricted. Only certified navigators and crown officials were allowed to consult the map. Updates came in from returning explorers, but revisions were made quietly, sometimes years before the information reached the public. Even other European powers suspected that Spain knew more than it admitted, and they were right. Similar practices took place in Portugal, where the cartographic secrets gathered under Prince Henry the Navigator were preserved and expanded in Lisbon's Royal Library. There, maps brought back from the Indian Ocean, West Africa, and perhaps even the unannounced coasts of Brazil were stored under lock and key. But not all of this information stayed locked away. Some of it leaked, deliberately or by accident, through diplomacy. Foreign emissaries were known to trade gifts of maps and manuscripts. In certain courts, maps were used as diplomatic tools, carefully curated to reveal just enough to impress, but not sufficient to empower. A sliver of coastline here, a mislabeled street there, always a game of control. And yet, even these limited glimpses shaped the ambitions of rival powers. In Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, where printing was flourishing, rumors of lost or forbidden maps fueled the imaginations of publishers and cartographers. They scrambled to recreate what they weren't allowed to see, using second-hand reports, sailor testimonies, and church documents to reverse engineer the secret geography of the New World. And sometimes, they got it right. Eerily right. This raises a provocative question. How much of the world was known before it was officially explored and mapped? The answer may be buried in a monastery archive that no one has opened in centuries, or in a royal ledger that has been misfiled and forgotten. It may lie in a map dismissed as a forgery, or in a Jesuit letter long assumed irrelevant. Because history isn't just shaped by what we know, but by who is allowed to understand it, and when. When maps lied, deliberate deception. But secrecy wasn't the only tool in the empire's arsenal. Sometimes the most powerful maps didn't hide the truth. They created falsehoods. As the race for territory intensified, maps became weapons of misdirection. Entire islands were invented, coastlines reshaped, and oceans narrowed or widened, not by accident, but by design. In Chapter 8, we explore the dark art of cartographic deception, how lies on parchment-shaped borders started conflicts and sent rival fleets chasing shadows across the sea. Maps tell stories, but in the hands of empires, they don't just tell stories, they shape reality. They legitimize borders, justify wars, claim oceans, and erase people. And sometimes they lie, deliberately. By the 16th century, cartography had become a battlefield, not just a reflection of exploration, but a tool of manipulation. A well-placed island could trigger a naval expedition. A misplaced river could shift a treaty line. A distorted coastline could delay a rival's conquest by years, and everyone knew it. Some of the most powerful lies in early cartography came in the form of phantom islands, land masses that appeared on maps for centuries, despite never existing. One of the most infamous was Friesland, a large, detailed island placed between Iceland and Greenland. It appeared repeatedly in atlases from the 1500s to the 1600s, featuring towns, ports, and even mountain ranges. But it wasn't real. So how did it get there? Some believe it was based on navigational error, a misidentified coastline, or a mirage in the fog. But others argue that Friesland was a deliberate fabrication introduced by mapmakers working with, or paid off by, states looking to muddy the waters of the North Atlantic. The more confusion, the more time to act. Another example, the island of California. For over a century, maps depicted the entire California region as a floating island, detached from the mainland. It first appeared in the early 1600s, and despite Spanish explorations proving otherwise, the myth persisted deep into the 18th century. Why? Because ambiguity was strategic. As Spain sought to secure its northern territories in the Americas, rival powers like England and France could exploit these errors to dispute Spain's claims. If the geography wasn't settled, then the politics weren't either. Even more subtly, maps were manipulated to reshape coastlines, sometimes by exaggerating the size of a claimed territory, other times by obscuring rival holdings. A map might show a narrow strait where none existed, or place a mountain range between two colonies, giving the illusion of separation and independence. The stakes were enormous. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas had drawn an invisible line down the Atlantic, dividing the non-European world between Spain and Portugal. But no one could agree where that line actually landed on the other side of the globe. The Portuguese claimed their slice included parts of what is now Brazil. Spain disagreed. The dispute wasn't settled with soldiers. It was fought with cartographers. Both crowns commissioned maps that proved their case, utilizing geography to support their legal arguments. And behind each official chart were versions you weren't supposed to see. Maps adjusted by royal order to strengthen a claim or weaken a rival's. In this climate, mapmakers became as powerful and as vulnerable as diplomats. Some were pressured, others bribed, a few were eliminated. The most skilled navigated a dangerous line, reveal enough to prove your usefulness, but not enough to betray your patrons. One of the most enigmatic figures of the era was Diogo Ribeiro, a Portuguese cartographer who switched allegiances and began working for Spain. His 1529 world map, the Padrón Real, is remarkably accurate for its time, but it's also filled with selective omissions. Certain islands vanish, coastlines shift. Some scholars believe Ribeiro used his knowledge to serve Spain's strategic interests, masking Portuguese discoveries to buy Spain more time to catch up. Other cartographers went further, deliberately inserting false leads to mislead their rivals. Take the mysterious Isle of Satanases, the Island of Devils. It appeared on 15th century maps west of the Azores, supposedly home to monstrous beings. Whether it came from folklore, sailors' tales, or political motives, its function was clear: to deter. Fear was a navigational barrier just as real as any storm. In many ways, these cartographic lies mirrored the larger game of empire. Exploration was never neutral. Neither were the maps that followed. They were instruments of propaganda, dressed in the authority of science, used to justify conquest and rewrite history. And they worked. Generations of explorers relied on charts that were part truth, part trap. Some sailed in search of islands that didn't exist. Others landed in the wrong place entirely, triggering conflicts based on errors that had been inked decades earlier. And when the lies were exposed, it didn't matter. By then, the claims had been made. The flags had been planted. Even today, echoes of those old deceptions remain. Borders drawn by colonial powers, sometimes based on faulty or fictional maps, continue to spark disputes. Place names invented by foreign empires still overwrite indigenous geography. The ghosts of cartographic lies linger. Because a map doesn't just describe the world, it defines it. And in the age of discovery, control over that definition was the ultimate power. But there was one institution that may have known more than any crown, any admiral, or any cartographer, and revealed less. An institution that sat at the crossroads of faith, politics, and knowledge. One that received confessions from explorers, dispatched missionaries to the farthest corners of the earth, and maintained archives the world still hasn't fully seen. In Chapter 9, we follow the trail to Rome, into the heart of the Vatican, to explore whether the Catholic Church knew about the New World long before it was announced, and why it chose to stay silent. In the shadows of Rome, behind the gilded walls of St. Peter's Basilica, and beneath the soaring dome of the Holy See, lies an archive. Miles of shelves, thousands of years of records, guarded not by soldiers or spies, but by silence. It is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, once known simply as the Secret Archives. And within it, some historians believe, are maps and documents that could rewrite what we know about the discovery of the New World. Because long before Spain or Portugal made their claims to the Americas official, there was one institution uniquely positioned to know what was happening across the seas: the Roman Catholic Church. By the late 15th century, the Vatican had become more than a spiritual authority. It was a geopolitical player, a force capable of mediating empires, drawing borders, and deciding, quite literally, who owned the world. When Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493, the Spanish monarchy didn't first turn to historians or geographers. They turned to the Pope. Pope Alexander VI, a Spaniard by birth, issued the now infamous Inter Caetera Papal Bull, granting Spain dominion over lands west of a meridian drawn through the Atlantic, with Portugal receiving the east. It was a theological justification for colonialism, signed by the highest authority in Christendom. But here's the deeper question. Did the Vatican already know the New World existed before Columbus made landfall? There is evidence to suggest it might have. As the spiritual overseer of a vast network of missionaries, bishops, and confessors, the Vatican had access to information no other institution could match. Reports flowed in not only from Europe, but also from traders in Africa, pilgrims in the Middle East, and sailors from port cities such as Genoa, Venice, and Lisbon. And crucially, it heard confessions. In an era when sailors, merchants, and explorers often died at sea, it was common to confess everything before departing, and sometimes after returning. These confessions were sacred, but collectively, they created a quiet stream of intelligence pouring into Rome. If a sailor spoke of strange islands far to the west, if a dying nobleman recounted a map seen in a court, if a monk received word from a fellow Jesuit in the Azores or the Canaries of sightings beyond the horizon, all of it could reach the Vatican. Even the Portuguese crown, known for its obsessive secrecy, maintained strong ties to Rome. Diplomats, clerics, and envoys passed through regularly, often bringing with them documents, sometimes maps, meant for papal review, and some of those maps never came back. The Vatican archive, even today, houses numerous medieval Portolan charts, many of which have an origin. Some depict islands that align with parts of the Caribbean and Brazil, dated before Columbus's voyage. Others contain annotations in Latin and Italian that suggest second-hand knowledge of transatlantic lands. And yet, these maps were never published. They were not used to launch expeditions or claim territory. Why? Because the Church's role was never to explore. It was to mediate. By staying silent, the Vatican retained its most important power, the ability to arbitrate disputes between rival Catholic empires. Once lands were claimed, the Church could step in to assign legitimacy, to bless or deny the ambitions of kings. Silence wasn't ignorance. It was a strategy. This strategy continued through the Jesuit missions of the 16th and 17th centuries. As Jesuit priests traveled to newly claimed territories in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they documented everything: languages, customs, flora, and geography. These reports were sent back to Rome, cataloged, analyzed, and then locked away. Some were used to brief popes and cardinals. Others were buried in storage, never to see the light of day again. The Church had created a global intelligence network, one that functioned not through spies or soldiers, but through scholars, priests, and penitent whispers. And while monarchs fought over land and glory, the Vatican sat above them all, quietly collecting the pieces of the puzzle. Even today, only a fraction of the apostolic archive has been examined by modern scholars. Access is limited. Permissions are rare. And when researchers do gain entry, they are often overwhelmed, not by what they find, but by how much remains hidden. Could there be a letter, a chart, a diary buried in those vaults that proves knowledge of the Americas existed before 1492? It's possible, but in the eyes of the Church, revelation must serve a higher purpose, not political advantage. And that may be the greatest secret of all. Because in the grand game of exploration, conquest, and cartographic deceit, the Vatican didn't need to plant a flag or fund a fleet. It only needed to wait. And when the time came, it would choose who was allowed to claim what, not based on who discovered it first, but on who served the greater divine order. Now, more than 500 years later, the maps drawn in silence, and often drawn too early, continue to haunt the historical record. What survives? What's still hidden? And what has been lost forever? In the final chapter, we trace the afterlife of the secret maps, how they shaped modern borders, fueled conspiracy theories, and left behind a legacy of mystery that refuses to fade. Because even when the parchment crumbles and the names are forgotten, the ghost of the map remains. Some maps are lost to fire, some go to war, and some are never lost at all, just buried deliberately beneath centuries of silence. Even now, in the digital age, the ghosts of these early maps continue to whisper through history. You see them in the odd curve of a border, in the name of a place that no longer exists, in the shape of a coastline that defies the age in which it was supposedly drawn. They are echoes of an invisible cartographic war, fought in shadows, waged with secrecy, espionage, and knowledge withheld. We may never recover the original Padrão Real, the Portuguese crown's master map. We may never know what was written in the earliest copies of Vespucci's letters, and we may never see the full contents of the Vatican's forbidden atlases. But the evidence is still with us, not in what survives, but in what doesn't. Why do so many 15th century world maps contain lands that hadn't yet been discovered? Why do they reflect navigational data that would have required direct observation? decades before the official explorers arrived? And why were so many early charts treated not as records, but as state secrets? Because they were never just tools for getting from A to B. They were instruments of empire, forged by kings, spies, scholars, and cartographers, all working in a system where knowledge wasn't shared, it was controlled. In this system, secrecy was a form of power. The knowledge of the Americas, the reality of lands beyond the horizon, may have trickled through Europe long before Columbus ever stepped onto a ship. It moved in fragments, a sailor's rumor, a monk's sketch, a Norse saga whispered over a tankard of ale. But piece by piece, the image sharpened. By the time Columbus sailed, some in power may have already known what he would find, and perhaps more importantly, they knew what not to tell. The legacy of these hidden maps is not just academic, it is profoundly modern. The manipulation of geography did not stop with the age of exploration. It continues today in border disputes, in redrawn maps of occupied regions, in propaganda maps produced during wartime. Even digital cartography is not immune. In certain regions, online will change based on who is viewing them, because even now, maps are often used as political weapons. The Phantom Islands of the 1500s have been replaced with contested airspace. The false coastlines have become disputed maritime boundaries, but the game remains the same. And what about the missing maps? There are rumors, of course, always rumors. Some claim hidden collections still exist in private libraries or forgotten church basements, holding pre-Columbian European maps of the Americas. Others point to maps like the Piri Reis chart, with its remarkable accuracy and unusual annotations, as evidence of suppressed knowledge. Most of these claims remain unverified, but the pattern is consistent. Too many early maps, too many coincidences, too much geography that doesn't quite fit the timeline we've been taught. It's enough to ask, what else was known? And what else has been erased? History is not a perfect record. It is a curated archive, a story told by those who had the power to write it and the motive to alter it. Maps were part of that curation. And when their truths became dangerous, many were removed. But like ghosts, they don't disappear completely. They linger in the margins of medieval manuscripts, in the archives of European courts, in the untranslated footnotes of obscure monastic diaries, and sometimes in the strangest places, a misfiled parchment in a provincial library, a forgotten engraving inside a ship's logbook. A clue surfaces, a coastline drawn too early, an island that never existed, a name that shouldn't be there. These are the ghosts of lost maps, and they remind us that the story of exploration, the story of how Europe came to see the world, is not one of sudden discovery. It is a story of slow revelation, of secrets passed in whispers, of maps made in the dark, hidden behind palace doors and monastery walls. The Americas were not so much discovered as they were unveiled, one secret at a time. And somewhere, in the silence between what was drawn and what was declared, lies the truth, still waiting to be found. They say maps tell you where to go. But sometimes the most powerful maps are the ones no one was ever meant to see.